Opening the center immediately establishes a foothold, setting the stage for active piece development. Establishing a central pawn, phalanx immediately contests white's ambition for a d-pawn outpost. Challenging the center's grip, this advance immediately seeks to control key squares and provoke a response. Solidifying the center, black prepares a robust pawn chain and future queenside development. Challenging the central d5 pawn stability, this knight directly contests key squares and prepares for potential pawn sacrifices or pawn lever advances. Developing a knight to its most natural square here prepares for further pawn breaks and supports a solid central structure. Solidifying the center and preparing for bishop development, this move aims for a stable pawn structure. Preparing to fianchetto, the bishop unlocks diagonal influence and fortifies kingside defenses. Establishing central influence and preparing kingside castling solidify white's position. Developing the dark-squared bishop to its most active diagonal, preparing to castle and contest the center. Developing this bishop opens lines for the queen and prepares to castle, solidifying the kingside. Safeguarding the king now allows for a freer development of pieces, preparing for future central action. Securing the monarch's safety initiates a period of planned development, coordinating pieces for the inevitable central struggle ahead. Pinning the knight solidifies black's central influence and prepares for pawn advances, creating a dynamic battleground. Challenging the bishop's influence, this pawn advance prepares to challenge the center's structure. Accepting the pawn structure shift opens the h-file, potentially a future avenue for your king if you're not careful. Unlocking the d-file for potential breakthroughs is the primary benefit of this queen repositioning. Gaining a tempo to develop the queenside while disrupting white's pawn structure. Recapturing the pawn opens the b1h7 diagonal, activating the bishop for potential pressure. Developing the knight to d7 prepares to contest the center and supports a potential e5 push, harmonizing piece activity. Shifting the rook to the open d-file centralizes its power, threatening further penetration and piece activity. Challenging the central pawn structure, black initiates a dynamic pawn thrust to seize initiative. Pushing the d-pawn seizes central space, forcing black's knight into a less active square. Solidifying the center now requires careful handling of the queenside pawn, structure's newfound weaknesses. Pivoting the pawn forward aggressively grabs central space, forcing black to confront the new pawn chain and potentially weaken their pawn structure. Preparing to contest the b-file and potentially break open lines on the queenside provides dynamic counterplay. Prying open lines with the pawn advance, white seeks to disrupt black's central pawn structure and gain an attacking foothold. Reclaiming centrality for the knight, this maneuver initiates a fluid repositioning aimed at challenging white's dominant central pawns. Consolidating the queenside pawn majority's attack is the objective, preparing for a pawn lever or a rook lift. Securing the queenside by creating space for the b-pawn to advance is a prudent step. Asserting queenside space, this move anticipates potential queenside expansion by black and shores up white's pawn structure against the encroaching knight. Challenging white's pawn mass, black aims to activate the rook and free the queenside initiative by contesting the open c-file. Shifting the rook to d2 opens a quiet pathway for further knight development or a potential rook lift, aiming to untangle pieces and improve centralization. A preemptive strike against potential king's side pressure, solidifying black's pawn structure. Concentrating major forces on the d-file aims to pry open black's central pawn structure. A solidifying knight retreat, reinforcing the queenside and preparing for a potential central advance. Targeting black's queenside pawns, this knight exerts pressure and opens avenues for further piece development. Liberating the knight from defensive duties unlocks tactical opportunities and contests the central d-file dominance. The bishop repositions, aiming to dominate the light squares and potentially eye black's kingside now that the central pawn structure is solidified. Re-establishing the rook's active potential, This prepares to contest the open c-file while eyeing potential breakthroughs along the second rank. Centralizing the queen offers excellent protection for the pawn and prepares for queenside expansion, aiming to exploit the isolated queenside pawns. Securing the king from potential queenside infiltration is a prudent, albeit slightly passive, defensive maneuver. Concentrating pressure on the c-file, aiming to exploit any weakness arising from black's pawn structure. This maneuver redirects the queen towards the queenside, eyeing potential pawn advances and seeking active placement away from the centralized tension. Preparing to contest the open c-file, strategically repositioning the bishop for potential queenside pressure. Establishing control of the open c-file is the primary objective now, potentially disrupting white's queen placement. Unlocking queenside potential, white aims to crack open the position and create attacking chances. Sacrificing pawn presence here allows white a dominant queenside initiative and potentially opens lines for attack. The rook lands on the 7th rank, aiming to destabilize black's queenside and create mating threats against the king. Sacrificing material to open a diagonal for the queen is a bold attempt to shake things up. Unlocking the c-file with the doubled pawns forces a dramatic endgame where white's queen aggressively targets black's weakened pawn structure. Reclaiming the knight offers a chance to untangle the queenside and potentially contest the open c-file for active counterplay. Sacrificing the bishop to unlock the c-file pressure and disrupt black's rook battery. Reclaiming material imbalances the queenside pawn structure, but exposes the black king to potential future aggression. Asserting central presence, this queen maneuver prepares for kingside penetration by leveraging the open diagonals and potentially exploiting black's slightly passive rook. Asserting the open file now demands immediate attention from white's position. Unlocking the queenside with the rook's new outpost, this probe targets weak pawns and future breakthroughs. This defensive maneuver finally addresses the queenside pressure, aiming to consolidate the weakened pawn structure. Trading queens now clarifies the pawn structure, setting the stage for a dynamic rook and knight battle ahead. Black's pawn structure is now permanently fractured, a serious positional weakness that will likely dictate the remainder of the game. Capturing the pawn initiates a decisive pawn-up endgame with a clear material advantage. The pawn chain is shattered, creating critical outpost potential for white's knights. Unlocking the c-file's potential, this bishop's placement pressures black's weak pawn structure.